Good morning. If you have your Bibles, turn to Daniel chapter 3. Daniel chapter 3. That's where we'll be this morning. It's good to see everyone here, especially if you're visiting with us. You're a welcome guest. I feel bad for you if you're coming down here expecting warmer weather. I'm sorry to disappoint, but stick around. I guarantee it will warm up eventually. It's good to have you here, and please stick around afterwards so that we can get to know you afterwards and get to talk with you. So Daniel 3 is a pretty familiar passage, to especially those who grew up in the church. It's a VBS favorite. And as we've kind of went along through the book of Daniel, we've talked about Daniel the last Sunday of every month. And as we went along, the theme overriding this whole book has been standing firm and loving well in a foreign land. That's kind of been the overall theme that I've been kind of specifically hitting at in this book. Now, a lot of the stories that we've covered so far, and future ones that we cover, are going to be ones that are pretty familiar to most of us who grew up in the church or have been in the church a while. And they're very good for children's stories. You have these very cool dynamics going on, overcoming vast odds, all these kinds of things. I kind of want to take away some of that and really look at the story, how it was intended, and not take out not boil it down so a child could understand, but really see it as God would have us to as adult Christians. That is the goal this morning. So what I plan to do is I plan on just jumping in the story and kind of setting some background, and then we'll kind of come back, we'll pull back, and we'll kind of set the framework, how it applies today, and then we'll jump in and continue the rest of it and be more powerful. So that is the plan for today. So let's look at what was read in the scripture reading today. You have the first 12 verses of chapter 3, in which Nebuchadnezzar, in the first verse, decides to make this massive statue. It's 90 feet tall. So if you don't know what a cubit is, it's about a foot and a half. And so it's 90 feet tall. I think this is like 20 feet, I would guess, somewhere around there. So like 4.5 times what the ceiling is here. It's a massive statue, and it is only 9 feet across, which is also very interesting. It's a very tall but narrow statue with a very shaky ground, you would think. And we don't know exactly why he built this image, but we know that we can have a few guesses. One is what story took place in chapter 2, right before this. But it was Nebuchadnezzar having a dream of this giant statue, this giant image that got destroyed by this rock, which is the church. And so maybe he was inspired by that dream he had, and he wanted to build this giant image. Also, from what we know about history, when we think this story takes place, there was a lot of rebellions kind of going on throughout the Babylonian Empire. It was a big empire. Occasionally, and especially it seems like at this time, there were a lot of revolts and trying to overthrow the Babylonian rule. So having Nebuchadnezzar set up the statue and having people from all the provinces, all the leaders come about down to it would kind of show your allegiance, show who you are really devoted to. And it would show and remind them who is really in charge. Because in that day, every nation kind of had their own god that they really championed as their god. And so if I conquered you, that means my god, the Babylonian god, whose name is Marduk, is better than your God. And so you're going to bow to my God because my God defeated your God because I defeated you in army. That was kind of the thought in that day. And so this polytheist mindset was maybe part of the reason that this happened, because of he's saying, I want you to bow to my God Marduk. Now, this could be an image of himself, I kind of doubt that. That's just not the culture this was in. It wasn't like Roman or Egyptian culture where they worship and deify their king and leader. They saw their king as equal to a god, but they didn't worship him necessarily as a god. So that's why I don't think it's necessarily a statue of himself. But Nebuchadnezzar does have a big ego, so I wouldn't put it past him. That's kind of something that I think he would definitely do. Also notice in verse 2 that he gathers all the local leaders. He lists a bunch of people, satraps and prefects and governors and counselors and treasurers and justices and magistrates and all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication. All of these people, all leadership was to come to this dedication and bow down before him. And it wasn't just singing some praise songs or declaring your allegiance to it. It is saying Babylon defines reality, that Babylon defines what is right from wrong. This is the most important thing in your life. It defines success and failure. In the end, Babylon is God. And that's what it is trying to get across. Babylon is more important, more powerful than anything in your life, and you need to dedicate yourself to Babylon. You can have your own gods. You can have your own system, but Babylon is number one. And as we know from studying Daniel chapter 2 a couple of months ago, when we see this word image, it should take us back to where? Genesis 1. When man was created in the image of God. We are the image of God. And we are, as the image of God, we're supposed to be like God, and we're supposed to rule with God. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to rule the earth with God, as partners with God. But what we see with chapter 2, now chapter 3, and various other times throughout the Bible, is mankind has taken the image and corrupted it, and made it, instead of pursuing to be the image of God, instead making it about themselves and ruling how they think and they want, and not being partners with God. They keep trying to make themselves equal with God and define right and wrong. And this is the same thing that happened in Genesis 3 and continues to happen throughout the Bible and through all of time. They supersede and they want to make themselves equal to God. But wouldn't you know it, three Jewish men, do not go along with what the king wants. And these Chaldeans, or I believe the version for the scripture reading was astrologers, each one could be the case, come and bring these Jewish men up before Nebuchadnezzar. And they say three things. Verse 12, they say these three guys have done these three things. There are certain Jews in the province that you pointed over. You did this. They have power. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you set up. In essence, they are saying they pay no attention to you. They have shamed you publicly. They have not cared about your personal honor. They do not serve your gods. They don't buy the national story. They don't have this national identity. And they do not worship the golden image. They are not doing their civic duty, what they've been told to do. They are a bad influence on the positions that they have been given. So, as we set this up, I want to kind of draw us back. Why is this important to us today? And not just a cool story about some guys standing up for their faith, rah, and then being saved from the fire. How is this relevant to today? I'm going to start with a quote by Baldur von Schirach. He's a German in the early 30s and late 30s, early 40s. And he did an interview with the London Times. If you don't know who Baldur von Schirach is, he was one of the people who really made the Nazi Hitler Youth really successful. And he was so elevated to a position that he became the Secretary of State and one of Hitler's right-hand men. And he did a really infamous interview with the London Times a few years before World War II broke out. And this is what he said at the end of this interview. One cannot be a good German and at the same time deny God. But an arousal of faith in the eternal German, that is, the Germany is the apex of human civilization. But arousal of faith in the eternal German is at the same time an arousal in the faith of the eternal God. If we act as true Germans, we act the laws of God. Whoever serves Adolf Hitler serves Germany, and whoever serves Germany serves God. And what's uncomfortable about that is you know where that leads to. Where those ideals, where those words, where that thinking leads to. One of the bloodiest wars to ever exist, casualties of untold, unthought of amounts ever happened. Death and destruction, and millions upon millions of lives destroyed and affected by World War II. This thinking that national identity and God wants this to happen. When society raises itself to the position of God, bad things happen. And there's always one of two things that happen when a state, when society, when government, when a culture raises itself to a position of God, saying, this is right and this is wrong, and you don't need to question. One of two things will happen, because they got to do something with the real God. One, they'll ban religion. They'll ban God. They'll ban anything that is not worship of the state. You saw this with the Soviets, and you see this with China and just general communism. They will ban all religion because it says something contrary to what the nation is doing. Or two, this is what Germany did. They will say that God supports us. God supports our rule. God supports us being in power. And God supports what we want to accomplish in the world. And this was what Germany and the Nazis believed. And if you think that this doesn't happen today, you are quite blind to what is happening in the world, because China still is conquering out and snuffing down people. It's gotten so bad that a lot of missionaries haven't been able to go to China because they have been so on top of it when they have been able to in years past. There are various places all throughout the world, especially if you think in the Middle East, of claiming that God supports them and wants them to do certain things in the world, and that nothing could stand in our way. But this also happens in maybe smaller cases here at home. We have especially one part of our political wing that wants to seemingly take more and more God out of everything in our life. And say, we don't worry about that religious stuff. We will tell you what is right and what is wrong, what's good and what is bad. And we have another part of our political party who more and more is becoming Christian nationalists and saying, if you really serve God, you will vote for me. And the idea is becoming more and more that God aligns himself with me instead of I aligning myself with God. Both are extremely dangerous, and they end up in the very same place that Daniel is at. It's with death, destruction, and havoc in the world. Both eventually lead there. Time and time again, every time in history, that's where it goes. And the question is, how do you stand up in an appropriate way to a nation that wants to elevate itself to the place of God? How do you do that? This is not just a children's story, some cool story. This is a very appropriate and big adult kind of themes for how to deal in a world that is foreign to the nation that we truly belong to. So let's jump back in. Daniel chapter 3, verse 13. I'll start reading there. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in furious rage, commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought. So they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said to them, "Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now if you are ready, when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the bagpipe, and every kind of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, well and good. But if you do not worship, you shall be immediately be cast in the burning fiery furnace. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" We'll stop there for a second. Nebuchadnezzar is actually very generous in that world, in that kind of time frame. Nebuchadnezzar was, and someone who has the power of Nebuchadnezzar would not normally give second chances. They would be like, "Oh, these people are doing it? Okay, just kill them. Like, that's nothing to me. Just be done with it." And so I think maybe Nebuchadnezzar is giving them a chance to say, "I did not make a mistake in putting you in these positions." And if you think it was hard for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to not bow when everyone else was bowing around them, how much harder is it now? Where you can't hide and hope for anonymity. You are right before the king. The furnace is right there, and probably pretty hot. How hard would it be to not bow down? And did you notice what Nebuchadnezzar said at the end? "And who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" The translation is, "There's no one powerful enough to save you if you do not do what I say." And the king has every expectation that these men are going to do what he says, because that's what he's used to, and they don't want to get in the fiery furnace. But notice what they do. Verse 16. Verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter. If this be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Notice what they say. This is maybe the most polite, nicest rebellion that Nebuchadnezzar has ever heard of. They're really nice. They're like, "Oh king, if we're not going to debate this, we're not going to have a theological debate. We're not going to serve you. But if you want to kill us, then you can kill us, and God may save us. But even if He doesn't, we're still not going to serve Him." And it's not saying, "You pagan scum, you are the worst person to ever exist. And just like really bash on Him. This is a very polite way of going about your rebellion to what the king wants you to go to. We do not think Babylon is God. If you need to kill us, that's fine, but we aren't going to bow to your image. Very polite, but very firm. Notice what Nebuchadnezzar responds in verse 19. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and his expression in his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And he ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated. And he ordered that some of the mighty men of the army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and other garments. They were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order was urgent, the furnace overheated. The flames of fire killed those men who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound in the burning fiery furnace. So verse 19, when it says Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury and his expression in his face was changed, there's a little wordplay going on here. So the expression of his face changed. So it is the image of his face changing is what literally is coming in. So think about the story so far. The king created an image that embodies the kingdom's power and authority. But he can't control these three Jewish men who won't give their devotion to it. And so the man who can make the whole world, nations, languages, all people bow to this image cannot control these three men and can't control his own image, the image of his face. It's like a ironic, you're supposed to chuckle at that this guy who built a 90-foot image can't even control the image of his face. And you notice also who bowed to the image. Everyone bowed to the image, including the Nebuchadnezzar's strongest men who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to the fire, and they were killed by the fire because the fire was so hot and was so out of what it was supposed to be. So the people that bowed to the image actually die in the fiery furnace. And we'll see later that the people who did not bow to the image were not killed by the fiery furnace. It's also an ironic twist. But also, it seems like Nebuchadnezzar doesn't even really care about these strong men, some of Nebuchadnezzar's best men being killed. And if you want a clear sign when a nation, a leader, a society has exalted themselves to being equal with God and thinking they know right from wrong, it is they see human life as expendable. When they see human life as expendable, you've gotten to a very dangerous place. The king is willing to throw away lives and have the kennel raised 7 times of what it was supposed to be. And in the end, it destroys the lives of those who are most loyal to him, just so he can have the lives of those who offended him be killed. Life doesn't mean anything to this man anymore. Life doesn't mean anything to someone who thinks they're at the equal with God and can tell other people what is right, what is wrong, what is good, what is bad. You elevate yourself way too high, and human life is expendable. Let's read the rest of the story, verse 24 through the end of the chapter. The king Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste and declared to his counselors, "Did we not cast 3 bound in the fire?" And they answered and said, "True, king." And he answered and said, "But I see 4 men, unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace and declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men, and the hair of their heads was not singed, and their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, "Blessed be God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except for their own God. Therefore I make a decree, any people's nation or language that speaks anything against God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn from limb. Their houses laid in ruins, for there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So what do we make of this story? What do we make of this interesting story in the middle of Daniel? One, I think, and that we can definitely apply today, is that these men stood firm. The whole kind of big takeaway in Daniel is standing firm and loving well in a foreign land. These three Jewish men stood firm. This is a story of obedience. They had the faith in God that He is able to deliver, but they also had the faith that guards the freedom of God, that if He doesn't want to deliver, that's fine. But no matter what, they hold to the truth of God, saying, we will not serve no matter what. This is a story of obedience. And it doesn't take you very long to think of all these different excuses these men could have come up with to bow to this image. Literally everyone is doing it. All nations, all provinces, all throughout Babylon, they are all bowing down to the image. If peer pressure was ever a thing, this was a good example. Literally everyone in the world, known world, was doing this. Yet they didn't. We don't really mean it. We're just, getting something off the ground and then we'll raise up and we'll be fine. We don't really mean it. It's just a little movement. Well, God is gracious. He'll understand. It's not like they're asking for us to give up God. They're okay if we still serve God. What good are we if we are dead? Think of how much good we can do for God and the Jewish people with this position. What good is it if we die? But there was no compromising. There was no yielding. They would not bend the knee. They stood firm. And you think about, how were they able to stand? How were they able to have such obedience? And I think there's a couple of reasons for this that we see here. One is, I think they developed a counterculture. It seems like you always see these guys together, these three guys together. They seem to be helping one another to stand. It's always easier to stand out in the world if you have people with you to stand with you. It makes it so much easier, and I think that's one of the reasons that God created the church, so that we can be together, so that we can encourage one another to stand up and stand out, even when it means consequences physically for us and our families. You can also tell that their identity was firmly placed in another kingdom first. Their kingdom was not of Babylon first. Their kingdom was in God's kingdom. And when the kingdom of Babylon, which they're just a visitor, asked them to do something against the kingdom of God, they refused. They knew their identity, and they continuously served God. You don't make this decision if you are not professing and serving God on a continual basis. If this is the first spiritual act that you've done, you don't make this decision. You can't just do this if you're just serving once a week. If God is not number one in your life, you will bow. And you think, they bow if anything else in their life is number one. Their families are number one, they bow. Because what's good for the family? If their career is number one, they bow. Because that's what's good for their career. If wealth or prosperity or the good life as they see it, getting ahead in the world, their own life, if any of those are number one in their life, they bow. The only reason they wouldn't bow is if God is number one in their life. Only if He is number one do they not bow. I think also what leads them to being able to stand up is they see how the world really is. There's a mockery of idol worship in this section, as there is throughout the Bible. But in verse 1 and verse 15, it specifically says the king created the image. And then verse 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 12, 14, and 18, it talks about the image that the king stood up. Meaning that if the image had not been stood up by this king, it would have never had the capability of doing it. It's the ability to see the emptiness behind the barrier, behind the facade. It comes a lot easier to stand up when you see the facade when you see the facade for what it really is and the emptiness. But also these men didn't just stand up, but they stood up in a loving and gentle way. Did they try to start a rebellion? Or did they lead a protest around the image, saying down with the king? They didn't do any of that. They didn't even call attention to themselves. Other men had to point out what they did. And even when they were before the king, they were super polite and they were firm, but they didn't say anything unnecessary. And do you guess, when you have the contrast of the raging, egotistic Nebuchadnezzar who throws away life versus Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are polite, who have their convictions as number one, who will not serve even when it means their life, even before they were delivered from the fire? Do you think that had an impact on the prefects and the counselors and all these people that are seeing this? I think it certainly did. I think it certainly did, because that's exactly what happened in the first century to Christians. It shows a contrast between the way of the world and who God is and God's people should be. But this isn't just a story about polite obedience. This is a story also of deliverance. Did God deliver these men from the furnace? In a way, yes. But also in a way, no. Did they have to go in the furnace? Yeah, they did. God did not save them from being thrown into the fire. They were thrown into the fire, and God joins them there. It is through the fire that they are delivered. And like we studied with Gideon this morning, just looking at our situation and our afflictions does not mean that God is not with us. It is in our afflictions that God is with us. David in the Psalm does not say you do not have to go through the valley of the shadow of death. He says, when I do go through the valley of the shadow of death, you are with me. That is the comfort that God gives us. Is even when we're the most severe of our trials and we're going through the fire of our life, that is when He joins us. August Landmaster, he was a ship worker, a dock worker in Germany in 1942. There's a famous photo of literally hundreds and hundreds, it seems like, of dock workers doing the saluting and Hail Hitler sign as Hitler passes by. But in all these hundreds, this photograph taken with hundreds and hundreds of these dock workers saluting Hitler, you had this one guy that's like this. Very obviously, I'm not doing it. I don't respect the guy. I don't like the guy, and I'm not going to do it. He stood up. He didn't bow, metaphorically, how we talk about it now. And if that guy would not salute in the face of death, because that's what ended up happening, he got found out and he got sent in the army, and he was killed. If that guy would not salute in the face of death just for national freedom, for a state of, I don't like this guy and the policies and morality that he has, how much more should we stand up in the face of persecution, in the face of test, to not bow the knee to anything on this earth? Whether it be our jobs that say, if you want to stay a job here, you have to lie, you have to steal, you have to bend the rules. And if you don't, who knows? You may lose your job. You may not be promoted. Are you going to bow or are you going to stand? Or in society or with people around you, will you stand? Or will you bow to what society wants? You know, you think about in Acts 4, When the apostles, Peter and John, were taken before the Sanhedrin and the leaders of the Jewish world and said, you better stop preaching this or else. What did they say? We must obey God rather than man. And if you want to boil this whole lesson down to one thing, it is that phrase. You must obey God rather than man. And Christians in the first century took that phrase and took that belief into their life. No matter who it was that told them to stop preaching, to do something that was against what God said, they didn't do it. And because of that, Christianity exploded throughout the world. We must serve God rather than men. No matter if it's society, job, friends, people, leaders, political parties, you name it. We must serve God rather than men. Many people here, many different stories, many different situations. I hope that you're able to apply this in your situation and serve God rather than men. If you need anything this morning, if we can do anything for you, please come forward as we stand, as we sing.